Hello, my name is Sabrina Woodruff, and I'm the Superintendent of Greeneview Local Schools. This is my 3rd year in Greeneview and 23rd year in education. I wanted to take this opportunity today to share with you information about our bond issue and PI levy, and how our journey has led us to this point. So 2 years ago, when I first entered the superintendency, one of the things that became readily apparent was that we had an inadequate space for our field house. I was approached by some parents that shared with me what they felt to be inadequate spaces for our current field house. And it didn't take long. It took one trip for me to check out our athletic facilities to understand why, although it had served us well, that we had outgrown that space. So one of the first items that I really wanted to take a look at was how we were going to improve that field house space for our athletes. But once I started to do that, what I realized is we really needed to take a look at our entire district and all of our master facilities. I also knew that we had an aging elementary that has been retrofitted several times for the age appropriateness of our students. The next step to that process then was to reach out to the OFCC, the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission, to understand more about Greeneview's history of the district and the other master facility projects that we had. I understood that we had a middle school that at the time was 10 years old, and we also had a high school that was 20 years old. So I was hopeful that there was still a part to the planning that would include addressing the aging elementary. And I was right in that the OFCC still did have Greeneview as part of, there was one more segment, as they call it, of the master facility plan that needed to be completed that did include the elementary building. So with that, I also learned that we were grandfathered into the way in which that project was to be funded. To my surprise was that the state would pick up 62% of a co-funded project, which left 38% as a local share to taxpayers. So that was very encouraging, and that we were grandfathered into that. I do know if we were to start from scratch on a project right now, that probably those numbers would be flipped. So with that information, the OFCC let me know that yes, we were on the list, but we probably shouldn't expect the opportunity to request funding for about 2 years. That said, it was good for our district to start planning for the process where we would land on a recommendation to the board for the master facility project. So we engaged a request for qualifications and ultimately decided on SHP, our design firm, that would not only help us with what would be the proper plan to move forward, including academic spaces as well as the athletic space, of course, to include the field house. SHP helped us with a community engagement process. We used a matrix that helped us select a cross-section of multiple stakeholders in our district. Whether you're engaged with the school or engaged with the church or the township, the village, etc., we wanted to make sure we had representation from across the district on that committee. We sent out about 75 invitations and ultimately ended up with about 50 individuals that consistently came to those meetings during the 22-23 school year. We met throughout the year, and the committee was tasked with ultimately landing on a plan that would make the recommendation to the board, or they would present to the board as the recommendation for how we move forward. No plan was off the table. I think that ultimately we started with 8 or so versions of whether it is 2 buildings, which is ultimately where we landed. We also vetted if we just replaced the elementary and looked at 3 buildings. Quickly it became apparent that 3 buildings was not the most cost-effective, most efficient way to be able to address master facilities. It was also frowned upon in some respects by the OFCC, again because of its cost-effectiveness. So from there, the committee continued to meet and ultimately land on what we call now the B2 option, or we called at the time the B2 option. And that presentation was made to the board in April. At May, the board really started the process moving forward such that we engaged with the OFCC in a co-funded project and ultimately now are on the ballot for our bond issue PI levy on November 7th. So what does the B2 option entail? What it includes is really an overall vision of getting all of our students and eventually all of our student athletes as well over to one side of town. Taking the current buildings that we have, the current middle school space would have construction and renovation to include pre-K through 4 buildings, so it would essentially become our new elementary building. That building was designed where the academic wing currently exists such that you can add classroom spaces. So that fits nicely with where the B2 option landed, is that we are able to take that academic wing and extend it. And there may also be some renovation for some other classroom spaces for our littles, especially pre-K, K, first grade students, to make sure that we meet specifications for what younger students' educational environments are supposed to look like. And then at the high school, then we would add an academic wing out the opposite side of the gym. So pulling 8th grade, if you will, back out of the high school academic spaces such that we would kind of have what would be the traditional middle school model. In a 5-8 wing, they would have their own separate entrance. There would be some shared services opportunities, but ultimately it would function as a middle school separate from the high school environment. Also included in the B2 option would be to move the athletic field house to behind the high school. Believe it or not, there is enough real estate there to include an addition to the high school, as well as a field house, additional practice fields, and eventually, although not included on the current bond issue, the vision is that eventually also that the stadium would move to the high school campus. There's 45 acres there. What would the field house entail? We know that both football and wrestling need their dedicated spaces and they utilize our current field house. But the vision for that really is that all of our student athletes can take advantage of that space. It would include an auxiliary gym, but also the thought of multi-purpose spaces that can be utilized during the different seasons in different ways. And the practice fields, the addition of the practice fields is also part of the B2 option. Again, separate from that would be the stadium that ultimately would make its way to that campus. I know one of questions that I'm sure you're wondering is then, well, what would happen to the elementary school? And the answer to that is actually we just sit tight. We continue to experience some growth as our enrollment projections do increase, but we also know that there's industry coming into our area and we can't fully know or make accurate projections of what that looks like. So it will be important for us to kind of watch as we see what growth looks like in the district. But at the same time, with the passage of the bond issue, it's likely that it could take 3 to 4 years before the entire project is complete. So students would need to stay in that building for that 3 to 4 years or for the entirety before we're able to really make that move from 3 schools to 2 schools. We're not quite sure about what enrollment is going to look like in our district right now. The OFCC will only fund spaces based on your enrollment, their enrollment projections, and that equates to square footage. So right now we're really working with what the OFCC is willing to co-fund. We know we have room for some growth or a little bit of stretch in the current proposal, the current model for the bond issue, but we just can't be sure about that. So we really need to watch that as well, knowing that we have additional space should we need it. And then from there, I mean, there are multiple possibilities, whether there's opportunity there for school-related organizations or community organizations or even private. But again, very hard to speculate. Could be 3 or more years out about what that would look like. I hope that what we as a district have demonstrated, the community advisory team is an example of this, that we took a year to vet a master facility project. But again, we would make sure that we gather input and engage the community in a way where we're able to share information about how we move along with the decision making with that property. I think it's also important to mention that as we kind of watch for, as industry moves into the area somewhat, I think it's also important to mention that on the two campuses that we have on Cottonville Road, both the current middle school and the current high school, there is enough space on those properties. We've done proof of concept tests with our design firm that we could add additional academic wings and academic spaces. So let's talk numbers. The total project is a little over $33 million project. I shared with you that the state, the OFCC, would participate in a co-funded project. That's not all of the project, as the OFCC really just focuses on square footage associated with classroom spaces, as well as some additional spaces. So they're not going to fund athletic facilities like a field house. They're also not going to fund, say, an auditorium, or even if you wanted to add additional square footage to your project. Those are what are referred to as locally funded initiatives, LFIs, that the state would not co-fund with the district. So the portion of the project that is co-funded that I mentioned was 62%, and together with some savings from a federal grant, $1 million, that off the top takes really 1/3 off the project cost. Again, reiterate, we've got 62% of the co-funded project, and then collectively off the top of the entire project, but a 1/3 of that will not go to the taxpayer. So I know the committee was very diligent too in making sure that kind of where we landed with what we needed was in a space that we felt like was appropriate for our community. The local share at 38% and addition to the LFIs as the total project for the bond issue and PI levy falls below $16 for a $100,000 home. So I'll say that again, for a $100,000 home, the cost to the taxpayer is less than $16 a month. I also want to mention that we do currently have bonds that will fall off in 2026. The current cost to the taxpayer would be $6.77 per $100,000 home. So you can kind of do the math about how that works, but at the same time, the district will work with our financial advisors to make sure that we come together with a payment plan, if you will, that makes sense. And will streamline that process for us. The bond issue PI levy will be on the ballot November 7th to include the bond issue, which includes most of the master facility project as well as the PI levy. And what the PI levy does is it picks up some of the additional LFIs for the total project. It also takes into account dollars that would be associated with maintenance of our buildings and facilities. And there also are some additional dollars built in that should we have additional building costs, that could contribute to that. Thank you for this opportunity to share information about the ballot issue on November 7th to include the bond issue and PI levy. If you have additional questions, you can email ballot@greeneview.org to have your questions answered. We take pride in that there is a master facility project proposal that is very practical and is exactly what we need. What I know to be true is that we don't want to cut corners, and we want to make sure that we do it right the first time. Our students and our families also deserve that. Thank you for your support of Greeneview Schools.